Nangamanladi. Hello to everybody. We say Nangamanladi in the Badi language to everybody. Hello, how are you? Okay, well, the first place to begin is I love this quote from an Yanuwa Elder in the Northern Territory. And he says, white people ask me all the time, what is Dreamtime? And he says, this is a hard question because dreaming is a very big thing for Aboriginal people. And so it is. So what we're doing with this course is this is just the beginning, hopefully, of a series of webinars on Aboriginal Dreamtime, and that so we can untangle that difficulty, why it's such a big thing for Aboriginal people. Okay, so Dreamtime or dreaming, these are phrases and terms you'll see used interchangeably. Dreamtime, of course, refers to that creative period long, long ago when everything was created in the world by the ancestors. And dreaming is the dreaming that is remains, the essence that remains in water holes and other places in all of creativity. And we're going to explore this idea of dreaming because everybody has dreaming. Okay, now some of you may know some of the Indigenous terms for Dreamtime. Al-Sharinga from Central Desert Way, Lalai from Kimberley Way, Jugaba, again from around Alice Springs. And I've put there just the DJ because it's actually, I'll hear people say Chokaba. It's not Chokaba at all, it's Jugaba is how you pronounce it. So one of the things for me, it's always important when you're learning about Aboriginal cultural matters and whatnot, is learn how to pronounce things properly, and there's a reason for that. So Jugaba, Dreamtime. Now, some people say, oh, you know, but Dreamtime is not a correct translation. But it's actually a term that I really like because for me, Dreamtime has within that one word the notion of a consciousness, and we all have dreams when we go to bed at night and that, but there are other forms of consciousness, not just dreams in themselves. And there's the time, which is about eternity. So for me, it's a really mystical term that I actually like. I'm not one of those people that are critical of the term Dreamtime. I actually like it because it conjures up this magical time in the past, and yeah, which is what it's all about. Paul Tasson from the Australian Museum explains Dreamtime like this. The Dreamtime is an Aboriginal English word that describes a world view, a philosophy, a way of life, as well as a religion. The most ancient eras of the Dreamtime describes the creation of the world, then the creation of all the different creatures that populate the world, and finally, the creation of people. And there are also ancestral beings, heroes that travelled across the landscape, shaping, transforming it, and creating all of the different creatures that now inhabit it. So just to summarise, Dreamtime is a world view, it's a philosophy, it's a way of life, and it's a religion. Now, again, some people have a reaction to that word religion, and some people prefer instead to speak of spirituality as opposed to religion. I don't mind which you use when it applies to the Dreamtime, so I'm not offended at all, but certainly there's room for discussion about where does spirituality fit within religion and vice versa, which we can probably have at some later stage. I'm just flagging some of the key elements that I want to touch upon in this session that we can explore in greater detail in later webinars. One of the beginning places for me, I don't know how many people recognize this man, but this is a very young Joseph Campbell, a prolific writer on mythology and religion, if you like. And I'm very much inspired by his work. Some of you may have seen this book, The Power of Myth, which is really a sort of transcript of the video series that Joseph Campbell did with Bill Moyers, in which they explored a number of different topics. And what I watched that series is from the I'm just trying to think, was it 80s or 90s? But absolutely loved it. And in particular, I liked how Joseph Campbell, he says, I've had an epiphany about computers, and he sees them as sacred beings. But the really other important thing that he came across with this concept is that he says, you've got to see spiritualities and religious traditions as they're a kind of spiritual software. And so you have to understand the programming language that makes up that spiritual software. So he says, now similarly in mythology, each religion is a kind of software that has its own set of signals and will work. And this is where Dreamtime comes into, is what I'm introducing you to, is what are the set of signals in Dreamtime that will help you understand exactly what it is. So he says it's like if you go through the father, then you have a different set of signals in terms of seeing God as a man. Or if you go through the mother, you'll have another set of signals. So I just find it a really useful concept, particularly these days, about looking at spirituality or religion as a kind of software. As Joseph Campbell says, each software has its own set of signals and its own codes or program language. And so it's something you have to learn in detail. So we're going to be touching upon some of that language, and I'm going to be from time to time talking about Dreamtime concepts, and I've just got it up on the slide to remind me about what where I'm going to next. The programming language really are the stories. They're all the Dreamtime stories, whether they're in traditional language or Aboriginal English. But they're also experiential. That is, they're based on individual or group experiences. So, for instance, if we were doing Dreamtime out in the bush, that's the experiential aspect I would be promoting more for people, instead of it just being an analytic academic exercise. So the stories provide us with the concepts and give us the concepts. Our instructors are our elders, and in particular elders that have a lot of cultural knowledge around the spiritual traditions. In the Kimberley, where I'm from, we call these elders Maban. So around remembering, Australia is very diverse, that lots of Indigenous groups have their own terms. You could perhaps ask the local people what are theirs, but Maban are also the traditional healers. So that's just a term that I'm used to, but that's what I'm meaning when I mention Maban. Sometimes you'll hear them spoken of as clever men or clever women, because people sometimes forget that women are as clever as the men too. But these are our Maban, very special people who hold the cultural knowledge, who take us through our learnings and teach us Aboriginal ways of being. I've been very fortunate to have been blessed with a number of elders who have taught me through the years as I've gone through. Some have now passed on into spirit world, and others are still alive today. Another form of guidance that we get are spirit guides. So as well as our very real living elders that teach us, we also have instructors that are spirits, and some people prefer to go that route and be guided by them. But it's just being aware of who your teachers are. Again, another Dreamtime concept is the dreaming of a place. You'll hear where there are sacred sites, and that people talk about the dreaming that area involves, if you like. So they're the stories, and they tell us the dreaming of a place. Another concept I want to introduce you to, and we'll be exploring these in greater detail as we go along, but is seed language. with Dreamtime, everything comes from a seed. It's planted in the ground, and so the dreaming of a place is about who seeded that place. If you're interested in reading more about that, I'd really recommend this book, Voices of the First Day by Robert Lawler. Now, Robert Lawler is an American anthropologist, I believe. I'm not sure if he's that, but I love this book. And I think he's one of the rare people that have come close to understanding and being able to describe the Dreamtime and becoming aware of Indigenous spirituality. So Voices of the First Time, if you haven't had a look at it, grab a copy and have a look what he has to say. But in that book, Robert Lawler talks about Gurruwari, the seed power, and how Aboriginal people use that. This idea that there's a potent energetic force, if you like, that are in seeds, and that is released through ritual and song and dance, and there's an essence that occupies these very special sites where that's released. And I like this quote from Robert Lawler. He says, "Only in extraordinary states of consciousness can one be aware of or attuned to the inner dreaming of the earth." And as with all altered states of consciousness, there are a number of ways of obtaining that. There are drugs, and there are some people who promote particular drugs like peyote and ashka, and I'm trying to think of that South American drug that's very popular these days. But my own view of that is I tend to steer people away from drugs, and don't touch them unless you're being guided by an Indigenous elder who can teach you about the right sorts of drugs to touch and the right dosage, because otherwise things can get really out of hand. Another way of obtaining an altered state of consciousness is through alcohol. I don't highly recommend that one either, because let me tell you, they don't call it spirits for nothing. And if you want entities hanging off of you, that's one way to go about doing it. Another altered state of consciousness can be obtained is through music. That's well known and documented throughout the world. And of course, dance. Dance, when you enter dance, as people know, mystic dance especially, that you certainly can enter pretty much and very quickly altered states of consciousness. And so Aboriginal people know this, and that's why dance is a very important part of ritual and of accessing the Dreamtime, if you like. Another method is through storytelling or sacred plays. And I don't know about you, but there's times when I've sat in just ordinary plays in the theatre and been transported somewhere else, because I think there's something magical that happens in storytelling as a way of entering these altered states of consciousness, if you like. Another way is through painting ourselves, and this is why we paint ourselves, because it's another way for us to access the Dreamtime and the consciousness. So the paints that we use are very sacred, and the ochres that we use are very sacred. We use them a lot in our dances and in our rituals. I love this little girl, this picture of her with the paints. But so there's something about putting on a mask. And again, Joseph Campbell has talked about the mini mask of God, because I think there's something magical that happens when we paint ourselves. And you'll hear Aboriginal people talk about painting themselves, whether it's their bodies or a work of art, with a lot of reverence for that word, because it's a very sacred act of painting oneself, and often certain friendships and bonds are formed when people paint themselves together without going into much detail. Okay, so other Dreamtime concepts. are of course the sacred. There's an element of Dreamtime that's very much has a secretive aspect, if you like, or dimension to it, and there's reasons for that. As we know throughout time that many spiritual knowledges have been abused, and Aboriginal people realise that more than most, and so that's why a lot of our teachings are secret, because there's this fear that people won't respect it, won't respect the knowledge, or will use it for the wrong purposes and abuse others. Now, we see this term used in secret women's business and secret men's business, and we've all heard that term. And it became very much, not popularised, but brought to the attention of most Australians during the Hindmarsh Island affair, which I'll say something about in a moment. But this notion of secrecy is attached to spirituality. It's not something new. There are many mystic religions that have a secretive element to them, such as the Kabbalah of the Jewish tradition and Sufism of Islam. So, but as I mentioned before, the terminology secret women's business came out of the Hindmarsh Island affair, which occurred in the 1990s in South Australia. Some of you may remember at Gujarra, which is Hindmarsh Island. There were some Aboriginal women who protested against the building of a bridge across the waters there because it was said to interfere with women's business. Now, I was just a young law student at Melbourne University, and like many of you, I wasn't made aware what the secret women's business at Hindmarsh Island was, and there was talk of special envelopes and whatnot. It's only in later years that I found out it had to do with the Seven Sisters Dreaming, which I'll say something about in a moment, and because I've written a book on the Seven Sisters Dreaming. And had I known at the time, I could have been called as an expert in this area, because this is in fact something that I know a lot about and have a lot of expertise. But that's not here, well, that's here and now, it's all gone. But I think what bothers me is the use of those terms. There's this Seven Sisters Dreaming. It's the use of this term, secret women's business, used by most Australians now as something gammon, something not real. And that's, to me, a real tragedy, because there you've had something sacred not understood. There's an example of not being understood and then being abused, and continues to be abused in this way, in the sense of which it's entered the Australian lexicon, because, as I said, that whole business, secret women's business, was about the Seven Sisters, which is related to the stars, the Pleiades. And here you have some women doing the Seven Sisters dance. Okay, another Dreamtime concept, and a very important one, is this notion of there being, well, of course, being many dimensions of knowledge, but in particular, in this world, on this earth plane, the inside and outside. So they're the Aboriginal English words we use. And the best way inside, outside is expressed as looking at a log, for instance. And the outside, which is the bark and whatnot, is the profane knowledge. It's known to everyone. It's not as sacred as the inside, which is the wood. So that inside knowledge. So when Aboriginal people are talking about stories, they're very careful about whether they're going to talk about inside knowledge or outside knowledge. And you might hear them discussing among each other, going, oh, what, we'll go inside way or outside way. And depending on the context, you'll hear someone say, no, don't go inside too much for this mob, just stay on the outside. So it's a really fascinating concept, inside, outside knowledge. Dreamtime concepts more. Okay, we mentioned ancestral beings at the beginning of this webinar. Ancestral beings, they're also referred to as dreaming beings. So these are the creators. So if it's a big man, red kangaroo that went through and created country, then he'd be known as a dreaming being, and so forth. So they are the creative ancestors. So when you see those terms bandied about, they're referring to the creative ancestors. In the Kimberley, where I'm from, they're the Wandjina creative ancestors, as one example, who travelled across the land, created things, named places, and so forth. As these creative beings moved across the land, they created what's called songlines, or dreaming tracks, also called dreaming tracks, songlines. Now, songlines, some of you may have read Bruce Chatwin's book that came out in the early 80s, I believe. The Songlines was a great bestseller, and he introduced this idea of the songlines to the world, if you like. There's this very funny story I've heard about Bruce Chatwin. As he was doing his research, he took a group of people out into country to, they were following a certain songline of one of the creative ancestors. So he has them sitting all on the back of his ute, and he's going along, and of course they start off singing, which is the songs that they're sharing with him. And as he's going along, after a while, he realizes this, what is normal singing has gone from that to almost like, oh gosh, I'm forgetting that name of those little quick little chipmunks that come out with songs. And so they've gone from singing Wadi like this, and so he pulls up the car and he says, "Hey, what's going on with you, Mob? Why are you singing like that?" I said, "No, Bruce, all time we used to walk. We're traveling in car now." So they was keeping up with the car and became like chipmunks. And a very funny story, because you could see that happening, and our mob have a great sense of humor, of course. I think it was last year, yes, 2016, Songlines became the theme for NAIDOC Week, and I really love this poster by one of the artists, an Indigenous artist. Sorry, I can't tell you her name now. I do know it was a young girl. And so that's her interpretation of these songlines. You can see they link up, they crisscross the country. So here, a map of Australia, Indigenous map. Right across Australia, you have all of those different Indigenous nations. So when we're thinking of some of these creative ancestors, some crossed from east to west, north to south, and you can see they would have travelled through different people's country. The implication for this, for songlines, is that sometimes you might have a songline for Wadi Gujarra, the two men, for instance, and say travelling from the north going down through the south, but they will traverse through different people's country. You may find that Wadi Gujarra songline is that really it's really an accomplished elder who would know it in its entirety. So as it's going through Bindabi land, for instance, Bindabi people might only know a certain element of or stretch of that songline, if you like. So just to be aware of that with songlines. So there are going to be a number of creative ancestors, as you can imagine, given the diversity of Indigenous people in this country. I've just put up some important ones. Wadi Gujarra, the two men that travel from north to south. Dingo Dreaming, which again comes more from east to west. The Seven Sisters, which is to do with the Pleiades star cluster. That is common throughout Australia, although they're going to have different versions of the stories. There are many similarities, of course. And one of the really big creative beings is, of course, the sacred rainbow snake, which has got different names right across Australia. So I know among the Noongar people of West Australia, for instance, they call it Wago, Wunambi in the Kimberley. Different names for the rainbow snake, but still the same sort of being, if you like, same creative being. There's my book, The Seven Sisters of the Pleiades, and what I do is I introduce the story that I was told about the Seven Sisters from where I'm from, but then it made me curious about whether that legend existed in other cultures, and of course it does. So what I did was look at those stories throughout the world and picked up on the similarities on that dreaming. It's a very big dreaming for Aboriginal women, and some of you will remember at the 2000 Olympics, that was the opening dance by the Aboriginal women, the dreaming of the Seven Sisters. In terms of Dingo dreaming, I just want to introduce you to this book by Deborah Bird Rose, Dingo Makes Us Human, because the Yarralin people of the Northern Territory, they have a saying which says, Dingo makes us human, and a belief that it was Dingo that taught them all about how to be human and how to behave properly as human beings. Fantastic book if you want to check that out. Okay, some more Dreamtime concepts. Just looking to Carla how I'm going for time.
Oh, you're going good for time, but you might want to go through from Catherine. She says, suggests the drug may be called Yanuwa.
Yes, that's right, Catherine. Absolutely right. I was trying to remember it, and it's a drug from the Amazon region, I believe, of South America. And there've been some people that are critical of its use by non-Indigenous people.
She's asking if you're an Indigenous elder, can you administer this drug?
Thanks for the question, Catherine. No, I wouldn't be able to administer that drug. If one, it comes from a different country, and really different country overseas. So I have not been introduced to the dreaming of that drug, so I would have to be educated. Of course, those elders from that region of the world where it comes from would be knowledgeable as to its use and application and whatnot. Yep. Are you aware of anyone who can recommend and refer? No, but I can find that out and get back to you.
Dominic suggested it's called.
Yeah, that's the correct spelling, and it's from South America. Ayahuasca. Yeah.
Dominic.
Yeah. There've been some criticism about some people like Stuart Wilde and others taking young people into the region without that assistance by Indigenous elders from that area. So yeah. Okay, thanks for those questions. We'll come back and look at that. Just further Dreamtime concepts. Many of you would be familiar with the Gaia principle from the Greek culture, of course, the notion that the earth is a living being and the earth is our mother. Those of you who have done cultural awareness workshops with me would know that one of the terms for Australia is Bandayan, which comes from the Kimberley area. And the notion of Bandayan is that it's a living being lying on their back. So you have the north being the head, the lungs going through the middle of Australia. Uluru, by the way, is not the heart of Australia, but the stomach, the sacred omphalos, southern regions, genital regions in the southwest of Bandayan, and then Tasmania being a foot that's sticking out as the legs stick out under the ocean. So that's an idea of the earth as a living being. So once again, it's not just Indigenous people that have this belief. A lot of people have this belief around the world. It's something that we do share in common with each other. I want to say something about sacred sites, because in some ways it seems a contradiction of terms, because we believe that all of the earth is sacred, so it's not just one spot here or there. But the idea of sacred sites is that there are particular areas in the land that are recognized as being more powerful, if you like. That Gurawari essence, the seed essence, is stronger in some parts of the land than others. And you will know this if you go to places of power, and there's lots of power places around the world that have been identified by people. But you certainly know when you're at a power place because the essence is so strong and so overwhelming. I want to say something about language because for me, I find that language is revelatory and tells us a lot about things because words have power. And I'm very much a big believer in, I use a lot of word play, if you like, because I find that I learn a lot through word play. And so when I look at sacred site, I don't just think of the locus of a place, like where a site is located, but what I can see, the opus, the sacred sites. So just that, love that wordplay between the two, the fun thing. Yeah. So Catherine Cavadas is saying, interesting that Uluru is the stomach, as that is where our power is generated. Absolutely, and the ancients always knew that, and so often the ancients said that our place of knowing is our stomach. That, you know how we feel things in our stomach? That's our intuition. So yes, absolutely fascinating. So the sacred fellows. But sacred sites is also not just about being at these places of power, but being able to see and experience things. And this is where our insight comes from. It's not just about, as I say, being located at a certain place, but our insight is that which we see, the messages that come through us through our insight. And that comes from visiting places, and this is why walking pilgrimages are so important to do all over the world. If you're like me, I love to go and visit sacred sites around the world, and I've visited quite a few, and I love to walk because it's in the walking that there's a sacred act that one undergoes, if you like, and undertake through walking. And we can, through the walking and being at these places, being open to the messages, we get a lot of, we may gain an epiphany, that's a big word, isn't it? Or epiphanies, that insight. And as we know, a pilgrimage is a journey, especially a long one, made to some sacred place as an act of religious devotion. And I'm sure many of you will have undertaken these sacred pilgrimages. I'd be interested to know which ones these are. For me, one of these was visiting the sacred Isle of Avalon in England, and let me tell you, I had some amazing spiritual experiences there. So journeying to these places are very important because as we travel and journeying, we're following the songlines or the dreaming tracks of the creative ancestors that went before us. So that's why they're important. Walking in the dreaming tracks. One of my teachers, I won't mention his name there because he's now passed in the spirit world, but it's written there. He always told me it's important to remember that the Wandjina walked everywhere. He said, Munya, they walked everywhere, and they did so for a reason. And what's really empowering about this is, especially for the stolen generation who often feel that, oh no, they go, Munya, I don't know anything about spirit, I don't know what my dreaming is, or I don't know anything about Dreamtime. And I say to them, look, nothing is ever lost, because as our ancestors walked across this country, they left the imprints of their essence on the land. And you can access it at any time, no matter what happened in your family history. And so I tell stolen generation people to remove their shoes, and not just stolen generation people, but other people that are wanting to follow in the footsteps of our ancestors, take their shoes off, walk on the land, and information comes to you, is what I was taught. It comes to you up through the soles of your feet. And again, there's no accidents with words. That's the soles of our feet. So Christine Carlton has got a telling, love the word play. Yeah, taking time to be with the words brings insight. If we sit with the words and not just use them to name or explain, you're absolutely right about Christine, and that's what I try to impress upon people. The words are absolutely essential, and the word play, and that's where we gain that insight from. Just to go back to the Wanjanas, it's interesting that in a lot of the Indigenous language in West Australia, Jinna means feet, so foot. So I want to explore that connection a bit more too. So your Jinna is your feet. So that it's very sacred to walk on the land and walk in the footsteps of our ancestors. Okay, Dreamtime concept. Again, Wunan. This is not just the songlines. You can see this wonderful map drawn by that Indigenous elder whose name I mentioned before, great teacher from the Kimberley. We're taught that these are the songlines, but it's more than just the songlines. The Wunan is a whole network that joins everything together. So you can see as Aboriginal people, we all join up together, and our dreamings and our stories and our knowledge all pass along these trading routes, if you like, the Wunan. But the idea of the Wunan is that it's like a net, and everything in it is contained. So everybody that's here in Australia, even today, you're all part of the Wunan. We're all part of this creative matrix, if you like, and so we all belong. In the Wunan system, there are no outsiders. Yep, none whatsoever. So we all belong. We're all brother and sister to each other. So that's the importance of belonging. Okay, going further into Dreamtime concepts, I want to mention fire dreaming, because this is a very big dreaming for our people. It's because it's the dreaming of creation. It's how we were created as human beings. And this is why fires are a really important part of our culture. And a lot of our teachings, if you like, our cultural traditions, our teachings, take place around the sacred campfires. And if you've ever sat around one, you will know just how enticing and how special a campfire is. There's something amazing that goes on for me when I'm sitting by a campfire and gazing into the fire, thinking about the mysteries of life, if you like. So there are a lot of fire dreamings around Australia, and the big one is that some of you may not realise, but the biggest fire dreaming is Sun Woman herself. In our culture, the sun is a woman and the moon is a man, which kind of makes me laugh, because a lot of my feminist friends are all into, you know, moon stuff and that, and of course it dictates our periods and that is women and women's business. But I always say to them, girls, get to where it's at with the power. It's with Sun Woman. Forget about Moon Man. He's just reflecting our power and our light. But she's the biggest fire dreaming, because it's her that brought creation into the world, if you like. So I mentioned a number of fire teachings. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. Again, very sacred fire teaching. Just looking at Carla to work out how I'm going for time. Great, 10 minutes. Good, that gives me an idea. The first of these fire teachings I want to mention to you is something called Wudu. Now, in the Kimberley, where I'm from, Wudu teachings happens first thing in the morning and first thing at night around the sacred fires. So you'd be lying around the campfires, the sun rises, it's time to begin Wudu teachings, if you like. And so what happens is we get our little ones and we place them in our laps, babies and toddlers, and either the parents or grandparents will first warm their hands by the fire, and then they sequentially touch different parts of the child's body. So touching the child's hands represents the need for honesty, and so they say, don't steal what is not yours. Wudu, that's forbidden. It's taboo. Touching the forehead with their hands is the warning to never believe that you are more important than others. So they say, don't let your forehead swell. Don't get big-headed. You know, you're not the only person on this planet. You can learn from many others. Wudu, that's wudu. It's forbidden. When the eyes are touched, they're implored not to be busybodies, to only see and mind their own business. Wudu, say the elders. That's wudu. When the mouth is touched, they are told to avoid gossip or saying bad things about other people. Wudu, that's wudu. Above all, wudu teaches the value of sharing and caring for one another throughout life and the importance of contributing to the community. So that's the secret teachings of wudu. We're in the process of developing a parenting program for Indigenous parents, so we want to reintroduce old traditional cultural practices like wudu to our mob, to teach them things. Moon man. So Dominique, moon as man and woman as sun, is that across Australia or just in the Kimberley? Good question. Predominantly it's across Australia, Dominique. As with any sort of statement, there will always be exceptions. I believe there are probably a couple or three exceptions that I can think about in Australia where that's reversed. But for the most part, it's generally accepted that the sun is female and the moon is male. So, wudu teachings, there we go. Another fire teaching that I want to just make reference to, it comes from the Yolngu people of Northern Territory, and it's Madayan, the carbon system of law. And so they have a tree that teaches about this very sacred system, and it contains the laws for people, for country, the way to believe. And they talk about Jalkari, which comes from the foundation of the earth. Of Madayan, they say that it's everlasting law. So here's a quote: when we burn the firewood, the thing that is left over when the fire burns down is the Nurungij, and it is the same with law. So that's that ash, the charcoal and the ash. It's the real law that lasts forever, not people's ideas and thinking. So these are very sacred things that are expressed in these ideas, Nurungij or Lirui. And often when I'm teaching people out on country about Dreamtime, the first that I begin, of course, is around the sacred fire, but about handing people a piece of log that's been burnt. And I get people to hold that log, and they see the ashes, and they have to hold it for a while and really commune with that piece of log, and I get them to share with me what they're picking up. And I can tell you some of the things that I've heard from people has been nothing short of amazing. So other Dreamtime concepts is this notion that you can commune with the land and all living beings, and that's why we sing country, because that's our way of communing. So language is important, song and dance. We recently, well this year in fact, the NAIDOC theme was the languages, and so I did a special talk to the SBS in Sydney, and I titled my talk, Can You Speak Kookaburra to a Snake in Tamarama, which actually comes from the words of the official NAIDOC song. So, can you speak Kookaburra to a snake in Tamarama? Communicate with a goanna. And what I was talking to people is about, you know, our people have found ways to commune with the land and with all that's in it. Again, Paul Tasson, anthropologist, he says, as with all dance, we find that we enter some sort of an altered state or a different form of perception, and some individuals who are so involved with the particular aspects of the ceremony are said to take on some of the features of the ancestral beings that they are dancing to or relating to in the ceremonies. So as an outsider, you're watching Aboriginal people perform dances. It may be a goanna dance, it may be crocodile or kangaroo. It may seem that they're just dancing, but for many of our people, they're doing much more than that. They're entering into the spirit of the Dreamtime ancestors and entering into a special place of being. Just in terms of language, the Bundjalung people of northern New South Wales say that it was the birds that taught us to speak. And so there's a great reverence for birds in our culture because they seem to be messengers from the spirit world. If you haven't seen this book, this is a book by Richard Trudgeon, Why Warriors Lie Down and Die. Fantastic book. And Richard Trudgeon was a Gujarra fella from Sydney who went up to Yolngu country a long time ago, 30 years ago, I think, or something like that, Gujarra man. And this book really is about his cultural immersion, if you like, in Yolngu country. And he tells the story, little did he realise. One day, anyway, he's walking through the bush with some elders, walking through, and he hears this frog croaking. And he thinks, oh, there it is again, that frog. I've heard it before, but I don't know what it looks like or what it's called. So he pulls up one of the elders and says, excuse me. He says, excuse me, could you tell me the name of that frog? And the old elder looks at him and says, what frog? That frog that's croaking now. And the elder just looks at him and then he just smiles and he says, that's not a frog that's croaking. That's the sound of the grass growing. And, you know, so Richard Trudgeon is thinking, what's he talking about? You know, here I am, I'm a man of medicine. I believe he's a medical doctor of science. I know that the grass can't talk. And yet somehow he had become so immersed in Indigenous culture that he had learned our ways of being, and he had learned to hear the sound of the grass growing, because that's what we do. We take our youngsters from the beginning through the bush and listen to things like the sound of the grass growing. And we do this through cultural practices such as Dadidi, which I'll say something about in a moment. But when I'm teaching Dreamtime, I teach people how to develop what I call dreaming ears and dreaming eyes. And the first way to develop dreaming ears is to learn to listen properly. One of these deep listening cultural practices called Dadidi by Aunty Munya Andrews, who's traveling around the country. We would play the video for you, but we don't have time for that. But I'd encourage you to look up on YouTube and check out Dadidi. As she says, we are river people. We cannot hurry the river. We need to move with the current and understand its ways. So she takes them through learning to listen to country and to come to a place of acceptance and understanding about everything in the world. We have to understand its ways, she says. So that's about going to the river's source. And that's where something originates or can be obtained from a source. Dreamtime Concepts, just in closing now, is about our connection and kindredness with all living beings, including so-called inanimate objects. Now, we're not alone in this, of course. Native American spirituality, very similar to us. They have this notion of kindredness, and they have names for, you know, Brother Crow, and you know, their grandfather Sky and Mother Earth, and so they understand this concept all too well, and including inanimate objects like stones, and they talk about the crystal people in a very loving and reverent way. With our people, sometime later we'll talk about how we're all related to one another, and so you might call Brolga mother-in-law or tea tree sister. This is that kindredness, and we'll say something about that in a later broadcast and go into that in more detail. Again, it all comes back to the Wonan, where everything is interrelated and interconnected, and everyone belongs and everyone is in relationship with one another, which I think is a really exciting way of being in the world, and thinking about ourselves as fellow citizens and human beings on this planet, that we're all on the same planet together, sharing the same journey, and we're much more related to each other than we actually realise. So that's the Wunan. I'll say something more about the Wunan. Just in closing, because I imagine some of you will join me in the other websites that's come, but when we meet up next time, I want you to, in your journal, to think about places that you've visited where your gi has warned you not to be or stay, because we say your gi will warn you if you're supposed to be in a place or not. I'm sure many of you have had that experience. If that hasn't happened, maybe go out for a walk in the bush now and see if you get that feeling. And I want you to also think about, did it feel like it was a place of women's or men's dreaming? And we can explore that more. And thirdly, what did the land say to me? I'd be really interested to hear from you, your personal experiences and your comments. So that